Everybody have a booklet? Anybody need a booklet? We started our series last week, and we want to make sure that everyone has one of these. If you ever miss a week because you're on vacation or something like that, you need the answers, text me, email me, send out smoke signals, whatever. I'll be glad to get you the answers to it. That way you can stay abreast of what's going on. So we started the first part, last Wednesday, and we looked at the four. In order to understand the Apostle Paul, I thought it necessary to go back in history to look at the setting, the era, the culture, the thing that led up to his time period of what he was ministering in. So I looked at the book of Daniel, which, by the way, that's where we're going to be at tonight, Daniel chapter 8. And so we looked at the world powers. Daniel saw in two visions in Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 7, four animals that characterized four kingdoms, as well as a statue made up of four elements, and they characterized those same four world powers. They would be the Babylon, Medes and Persians, Greece, and then Rome. And we got through point number 1 and 2 last week as we looked at briefly the Babylonian conquest and the Persian dominion. Now today we want to look at the Grecian Empire, number 3 in our notes today. Letter A there, the Persian Empire fell to Alexander the Great in 331 BC. Now keep in mind, that's extremely important. This is before Christ. Remember, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, there's going to be 400 years in between. So this is happening during that time. So the Babylonians were existing during the Old Testament. The Persians were happening during the Old Testament. It was Cyrus who allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to return. So we know that the Medes and the Persians were there. We know the Babylonians were there. But during the between the Old Testament and New Testament period, this is when Greece happens and Rome happens. So it's an extremely important time period. Letter B, Alexander conquered much of the known world as far as India and south into Egypt. Letter C, the spread of Greek culture and language was known as Hellenization. So spell hell with two L's, H-E-L-L, E-N, ization, I-Z-A-T-I-O-N, Hellenization. Now, by looking at the word, you might think, well, who was Helen? You know, but they called it that for a reason. Now, let's say that you're Alexander the Great, and your kingdom was vastly spreading quickly. And you wanted everyone to be able to coordinate finances and trade and e-commerce, commerce, all of these things. And you wanted the same culture, the same coinage, the same language to be used. You needed to pass all that information on. That process was called Hellenization. The reason is because the Greek word Hellene means Greek. That's what it means, Greek. So to make Greek would mean Hellenization. So that's where they get the term, Hellene. It's the word that means Greek. So for the next several hundred years, Greek was the common language of the Mediterranean world. The greatest contribution of this empire to New Testament Christianity was its language. Greek became the lingua franca, or the common language of the Mediterranean world. I actually made up the pronunciation. I have no idea how that's pronounced. I could have looked it up, but I thought I would come across smart, amen? But that's what it looks like to me. All New Testament books were written in Koine. I did look this up. Koine Greek, or Koine, really Koine Greek. It just means common Greek. As Alexander turned towards Jerusalem, and in your notes I have the word legend underlined, and I did that on purpose because I could not find, and usually when I put dates down here or history facts or biblical, I'll have two references. I've checked out information more than one source. But on this case, I found one source, and it clearly said it was legend. So I want to emphasize that I don't have any historical data for this or biblical data, but it is interesting. As Alexander turned towards Jerusalem, legend has it that he was met by the Jewish high priest Jaddua, who told him of Daniel's prophecies of Greek victory over the Persians, which is Daniel chapter 8, which is where we're going to be. Alexander spared Jerusalem because of that. He offered a sacrifice to God and had the prophecies of Daniel read to him. So we're in Daniel chapter 8. I want to show you the supposed scripture that was read to Alexander the Great. It does make sense to me that this would happen, but again, I cannot prove it. Daniel chapter 8, look with me at verse number 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared unto me, even unto me, Daniel, after that which appeared unto me at the first. And I saw in a vision. So 2 times already it's a vision. Look at the end of verse 2. I saw in a vision. So now 3 times Daniel clearly says, I saw it. It was a vision. God gave me this vision. Look at verse 3. Then I lifted up mine eyes and saw. Now stop there. Do you remember how Daniel already in Daniel chapter 2 saw a statue? In Daniel chapter 7 he saw 4 beasts that characterize these 4 world powers. Well, in Daniel chapter 8 he's going to now see something else. He's going to see an animal, and it's going to be symbolic of something. Look again at verse 3. And behold, there stood before the river a ram. Now, if you're in the habit of marking your Bible or writing in the leaf or whatever, that ram is the Medes and Persians. Now, you're like, how in the world do you get that out of there? Are you straining out a gnat? You drawing straws? What are you doing, Pastor? How do you know that's the Medes and Persians? Watch this. Which had 2 horns. A kingdom that had 2 factions. Certainly wasn't Greece. It wasn't Rome. It wasn't Babylon. Medes, Persians had two. Remember, the Medes were superior, but then Cyrus was a Persian, and he had an insurrection and overpowered. They became more powerful. So this ram is the Medes and Persians, has 2 horns. One's Medes, one's Persians. And the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other. And the higher came up last. So we're talking about the Persians there. I saw the ram pushing what direction? All right, now look up here. I'm going to turn my back against you, but just so we can get on the same page. All right, so the Babylonians were way down here. The Medes and Persians are up here. They're to the east, but they're spreading westward. Guess what country's over here? Greece. Well, they're going to spread and go what direction? Eastward. So the 2 are going to be meeting, and the Greece is going to beat up the Medes and Persians. Well, this Medes and Persian is characterized by a ram. So the ram is going westward. Look at it again in verse number 4. I saw the ram pushing westward and northward and southward. So they're spreading, the Medes and Persians, so that no beast might stand before him. Neither was there any that could deliver out of his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. Now, verse 5 is going to be mentioning another animal that's going to be characteristic of Greece. And as I was considering, behold, an he-goat. So the ram is Medes and Persian. It's got 2 horns. The goat is Greece. Watch this. Came from the west. And he-goat came from the west on the face of the whole earth. and touched not the ground, and the goat had a notable horn. That's Alexander the Great. The one that is leading, a notable horn would be the one that's leading, it's in the front of it. And so coming from the west would be Greece, but it's heading east, but the Medes and Persians that are east are coming west, and so the ram is going to be fighting the goat, and the goat is going to come out on top, or Greece is going to come out on top. So you can imagine if this legend is true, this would clearly make sense, because Alexander sees this and said, this was prophesied, and so he's going to favor the Jews because of this. And verse number 6, and he came to the ram that had 2 horns. Remember, that's the Persians, the Medes and Persians, which I had seen standing before the river, and ran unto him in the fury of his power. And I saw him come close unto the ram, and he was moved with choler or anger against him, and smote the ram. So the goat's beating up the ram, or Greece is beating up Medes and Persians, brake his 2 horns, and there was no power in the ram to stand before him. Okay, so that spells the defeat of the Medes and Persians. But he cast him down to the ground and stamped upon him, and there was none that could deliver the ram out of his hand. Now, so there's the transition that Daniel saw in a vision, 3 different times a vision, of the transition between the Medes and the Persians and Greece, or Alexander the Great, the notable horn. So years pass, and Alexander the Great, his kingdom is conquering, Hellenization is happening, the coinage, the culture, and the language is being passed and spread around to everybody. Alexander the Great dies. He has a set of generals that are going to now then take over, but they will never, because of fighting and friction in-house, they never become strong again like Alexander was. And it begins to diminish the kingdom, and that's where Rome is going to take over. We know the number of generals, not only historically, but biblically. Look at verse 8. Therefore the he-goat, that's Greece, waxed very great, and when he was strong, the great horn was broken, for it came up, how many notable ones? 4, toward the 4 winds of heaven. So there are 4 generals. That's your note in letter D there. After Alexander died, his empire was divided among his 4 generals. In verse 22, now that being broken, whereas 4 stood up for it, 4 kingdoms shall stand up out of the nation, but not in his power. So they were never by themselves or collectively as strong as Alexander the Great was when he was in power. All right, now you are in Daniel. Flip back to the book of Ezra. Ezra. So if you get to 2 Chronicles, you've gone just a tad too far. Ezra's right after that. Chapter 5. So we want to take some time tonight to look at Jewish nationalism. What was going on in the mentality of the Jews during this time? Well, keep in mind the Medes and the Persians were the ones that allowed, particularly the Persians, allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to come back and rebuild. But now they're conquered. Alexander the Great has conquered them. So how are the Jews going to relate to these Greeks that are now in charge of the whole vast empire? How are they going to think of themselves as nationalist people or prideful people? Like we would say, we're glad to be an American. How do they take pride in their country that is rebuilding? All right? So I'm in number 4 in the notes there. Letter A, the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew are known as the silent years. Now, it's not that God was not working, because clearly he was working, setting up a Greek culture, coinage, and language that would be necessary, and also the Roman government that would be necessary to help spread the gospel and to write the New Testament. So God was clearly working. But as far as revealing Old Testament prophets, the Old Testament was done, and he hadn't started yet revealing the New Testament words. So God was silent. So they nicknamed that 400-year period the silent years. Letter B, this period began with the conclusion of the post-exilic prophets. Now, I don't want to assume that you know what that is, so let me explain in case you're not familiar with that term. Anytime you see the word exilic, it means exile. And so we're talking about the Babylonian captivity. Remember, the nation of Israel was two parts. Israel, they were captured and taken by Assyria, but the Babylonians came and conquered Judah, and they took them away for 70 years. And the Medes of Persia beat up the Babylonians, and all the history that we've already gone over is done. Well, after the exile is over, any preacher who spoke afterwards is called a post-exilic prophet, because he's preaching after the exile. And so there were some. So when Cyrus gave permission for Ezra and Nehemiah and Zerubbabel, led a group of people out, all these Jews returning to rebuild the temple and rebuild the wall, there were preachers there in Jerusalem preaching God's word. Well, who were these preachers? Well, the book of Ezra tells us two of them. Look at Ezra chapter 5, verse 1. Then the prophets, Haggai, the prophet, and Zechariah, the son of Iddu, prophesied unto the Jews that were in Judah, Jerusalem, in the name of the God of Israel, even unto them. And talks about Zerubbabel bringing people there. But notice it mentions Haggai and Zechariah. So let's go there. Let's go to Haggai and Zechariah. Now, if you're not familiar with where they are, go to the end of the Old Testament, which is Malachi, and go right before that. Zechariah is right before Malachi, and Haggai is right before that. Once you find both books, which in my Bible is only 2 pages apart, Haggai is very short. I always remember Haggai because he's the guy that I want to say, hey, guy. It's a dad joke. All right, so if you would, turning to Haggai 1:1 and Zechariah 1:1, if you can somehow look at both at the same time by just kind of holding the pages in between. Look at Haggai 1:1. Somebody tell me, what year of Darius was it? Now look at Zechariah 1:1. What year of Darius was it? Second. So the two books are happening in the same year. Now look at the same verse. What month was Haggai preaching? 6th month. And what month was Zechariah preaching in? 8th. All right, so these preachers are only 2 months apart. They're contemporary preachers. And so they're preaching at the same time Ezra is coming back. So you got Ezra, Nehemiah, you got Haggai, Zechariah, and of course Malachi. These are all post-exilic preachers. All right? And so that's letter B. Letter C. This period ended with the announcement of John the Baptist's birth. Letter D. The silent years began under the Persian rule, Persian, Persian, and ended with the Roman rule. So that 400-year period, it started with one rule, but ended with 2 ones later. Persians, and then it skipped the Greek, and then it began with the Roman rule. So these 4 world powers, I hope you understand in my thinking why it was necessary for us to go back and discuss these 4 world powers to set up the stage for Rome, because that's what's in power when Paul is in charge, or when he's ministering. Letter E. In 198 BC, now we're getting closer and closer to zero, Judea was conquered by Antiochus the Great and came under the control of Syria. Letter F. Under pagan Syrian rule, the Jews were being pressured to Hellenize, to accept the Greek culture, coinage, the language. They were being pressured to do that. That created a spirit of resentment and nationalism that went on until 70 AD. Now, to give you some perspective, this is not quite the same thing, but in Southern California, in 2000, the census was taken, and there were four major groups of ethnicities: whites, blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. The whites and the blacks were the majority. 10 years later, 2010, the Asians and the Hispanics were the majority. The whites were part of the minority at that time. I don't know what the census was in 2020, because I was here, but nevertheless, you can imagine. And some of the Home Depot signs, the English was the subtitles. So we felt like we needed to be more vocal to keep our culture, because this was our culture first. And so somewhat of that same thing, if you can imagine the Jews trying to maintain their culture while the Greek culture is being pressed on them. Okay, it's not quite the same thing, but I think we can sort of understand that. So while this was going on, there's these groups of people that says, we don't like the government, we don't like the government, and there's these little coups and insurrections coming up. So let's flip over to Acts, please, the book of Acts. Let me show you a couple of these that popped up. Acts chapter 5. That's what I mean, a spirit of resentment and nationalism, to be pressured to change according to the Greek culture. Acts chapter 5. Look with me at verse 36. For before these days rose up Theudas. Now, I pronounce the guy's name Theudas, and you'll see why in just a second, but it's actually Theudas, boasting himself to be somebody, to whom a number of men, about 400, joined themselves, who was slain. And all, as many as obeyed him, were scattered and brought to naught. So in other words, this guy by the name of Theudas was there, and it says, follow me, let's not like the government, let's not be pressured to do this. And those 400 people were squelched. Well, here comes another guy. Look at verse 37. After this man rose up Judas. That's why I call him Theudas. It's easy to remember, Theudas and Judas. But Judas of Galilee, this is up north, in the days of the taxing. Well, these guys didn't like the government taxing them, so they said, we're not going to pay. No way, Jose. I'm sure the people in charge's names were Jose. And drew away much people after him. He also perished, and all, even as many as obeyed him, were dispersed. So there's two instances, one guy by the name of Theudas and one by the name of Judas, who led this nationalistic saying, hey, we're not going to be pressured to follow suit. Let me show you one more. Turn over to Acts chapter 21. Now, when we get to chapter 21, we will take a look at this more extensively, of why Paul was being accused. But basically, somebody is accusing Paul of being somebody and falsely making an accusation, saying, Paul, aren't you that guy? Okay, so don't worry about the storyline right now, but the reference is what I'm referring to. Chapter 21, verse 38. Art not thou that Egyptian which before these days made us an uproar and led us out into the wilderness 4,000 men that were murderers? So again, whether it was 400 with Theudas and Judas led some people away, or this guy, this Egyptian who led thousands astray, there was these small little groups coming up and says, hey, we're not going to follow what you're trying to pressure us to do. All right, so let's go back to our notes. Letter G. On December 25th, 168 BC. This is still before Christ. A guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. Has anybody in here heard his name before? Okay. He polluted the temple in Jerusalem by setting up a pagan altar and sacrificing a sow. He burned all copies of the Torah. He banned Jewish sacrifices and feasts. He killed mothers who circumcised their babies. And Greek gods were erected, and an idol of the Olympian Zeus, Z-E-U-S, that should be a blank there, Zeus, was placed on the altar of the temple. Zeus. So, for those of you that are not familiar with this guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, not only did he do something sacrilegious, defying the Jewish culture, doing something, defying God, all of this, but in Daniel chapter 11, it talks about Antiochus Epiphanes. It doesn't mention his name, but it calls him a vile person, and it calls him a person who used flatteries and who entered peaceably. The reason why that's so important historically and biblically, because Antiochus Epiphanes is a picture of Antichrist, who's going to enter into a peaceful, flattering relationship with Israel, but will change and defile the temple, the abomination of desolations, much like this historical figure did of Antiochus Epiphanes. And so that's why I think that's so important. But that, again, is before Christ. There's another historical event that took place, and I would encourage you to read up on this because you can find literally books written on this. Letter H. When an official attempted to force an old priest named Mattathias to offer a pagan sacrifice, Mattathias killed him, then fled with his sons into the wilderness. By the way, it's hard to take a book or a lot of history and try to boil it down to a paragraph. And so I've tried my best to, and I know some of you history buffs like Rick and others could probably sit there and say, well, you didn't even mention this and this. You know, you have to kind of pick and choose information, you know. But this action sparked a major insurrection, started a guerrilla warfare that eventually defeated the Syrians and liberated Jerusalem. The Jewish feast of Hanukkah, Hanukkah, commemorates this. The revolt was led by Mattathias' son, Judas, who was called Maccabeus. The revolt is now known as the Maccabean Revolt. And if you were to look online, that's what you would research under, which went from, and it gives the dates there. But again, we're getting closer to BC. Okay, you should have a chart coming up. We're going to go through the chart just to give you an idea of where we're going to end at tonight. So we're on letter I. We're going to go through, 4 more notes here, and we're going to look at the chart, and then we'll be done, okay? You do have all that, right? All right, hang with me. Letter I. Simon Maccabeus secured a treaty with Rome, halting the Syrian attacks, giving the Jews a period of political freedom. Letter J. This is where it gets interesting. During the reign of Simon and his son John, which is in history called the Hasmonean dynasty, 2 parties emerged. The first one, I'll spell it for you, H-A-S-I-D-I-M. Hasidim. Hasidim. H-A-S-I-D-I-M. They were very conservative groups of people who really formed what is now known as the Pharisees. They had to emerge in order for the Gospels, because in the Gospels, that's who Jesus preached oftentimes his messages and condemned the Pharisees. So they had to exist before Christ came on the scene. And this was the beginning of these Pharisees that were there. By the way, the root word hasid or hasid means pious. Let me tell you a quick story. When we were in 2014 in Israel, we were going to take a night tour to an underground tunnel. And there was some political unrest going on. And so on the bus, they said, sorry, we can't take you to that tour. You're welcome to get off or go to such place. And so we decided to stay on. We're going to only be in Israel one time, so as far as we knew. And so we thought, well, let's just take it. We went there, but we had to go through the old part of Israel. And there were like brick roads and such, and people were dressed in the very Orthodox Jewish outfits. One guy spat on us. We're driving this huge tour bus. If you can imagine, the big, giant tour bus through these streets, you know, and they got signs there that talks about Westerners and dress codes and all this. Well, these Hasid Jews, these strict Jews, Hasidic Jews, they refrained, particularly on Sabbath days, refrained from electricity, transportation, work, internet, TVs, phones. They refrained from interactions between men and women on the Sabbath. There no financial transactions, and they maintain a strict dress code all week long. And so there's a lot about the Hasidic Jews that you can research, but that's really where it stemmed from. Then number two, the second group are the Hellenizers. And since you already know Hellenization, it's spelled the same way, but Izers instead of Ization. Hellen, Izers. And these were kind of more of a liberal, accommodating the culture. And this was the beginning of the Sadducees, a governing body. So these two groups, Pharisees and Sadducees, had its beginning here BC. Letter K. The Hasmonean dynasty was characterized by civil disorder, corruption, and political problems. If you want to read up on that historically, it's kind of interesting. There's a couple of coups and slicing of the necks and beheadings and kind of a brutal time. Then letter L, eventually Rome decided to intervene in these Judean affairs in 37 BC. So we're getting real close to AD. Marcus Antonius, Mark Antony, who loved Cleopatra, that's the blank that you want to fill in there, made Herod the Great the king of the Jews. It was during the rule of Herod that Jesus was born. Now, you have this chart here. I would encourage you to write on it. We're going to go through a couple of these Herods here. Because as we read the book of Acts to study the life of Paul, it'll just say sometimes Herod, Herod, Herod. Well, which Herod? And so I want to give you now which Herod we're talking about, okay? So just real quick. So you see all of this stemmed from Esau. Underneath Esau, you have Herod the First. He's known for two things, if you want to kind of make a notation. Number one, he's made for building projects. He's the guy that was responsible for building the temple. Do you remember when Jesus even commented about the stones will be torn down eventually? He's talking about the building of the temple. The second thing that he's known for is not only building projects, but killing babies. Killing babies. It was Herod, or Herod the Great, who said, I've heard that there's going to be a king of the Jews born. Let's kill all and massacre all the babies. That's him. All right, so go to your left, all the way down where it says Herod Agrippa the First. Do you see that? Herod Agrippa the First? He was known for two things. Number one, he executed James, or killed James, and he imprisoned Peter. So that's that guy. So anytime we mention or read through Acts and you mention Herod, you can always refer back to this chart. Underneath Herod Agrippa the First is Herod Agrippa the Second. And at the end of the book of Acts, Paul is before Herod, and it was Herod that says, almost thou persuadest me. So that's how you can notate him. He was the guy that was almost persuaded. Okay, right in the middle there, you have four more Herods. You see, first of all, Herod Philip the First, right in the middle. Now, this guy, you can't find much about him in the Bible. You can't find much about him in history. But I'll tell you, he was known for, in my opinion, known for not what he did, but who he married. He married a woman by the name of Herodias, and they had a daughter by the name of Salome. Does that sound familiar, Herodias? Okay, so that's the story where there's a woman dancing, and the king goes, what do you want? And they go, give us John the Baptist's head. That's how that mess came about. The next guy to the right, Herod Archelaus. What's interesting about him, in history, he was extremely cruel. Do you remember the story when Joseph and Mary, when they had to leave their land for a while, but when they were coming back, it says they did not enter into Judea because of Herod. He was cruel and he was killing people during that time. So where did they go? They went up north and settled in Nazareth. It was because of that Herod. Herod Archelaus. So however you want to put next to that, to notate that difference, guy. And then to the right is Herod Antipas. He's known for three things. Do you remember Herod Philip, how he was married to Herodias? Herod Antipas sweet-talked Herodias into marrying him. So he's having this relationship with Herodias, Philip's wife, and that's what John the Baptist preaches against, and they don't like it. The second thing is he's the guy that beheaded John the Baptist. And thirdly, Herod Antipas was the guy, later when Christ is being questioned, he's the guy that mocked Christ and put a royal robe on him. So however you want to summarize that. Then lastly, Herod Philip II. He's the guy that founded Caesarea Philippi. And if that's not important to you, one of the things that takes place there is Christ will say to his disciples, "Whom say ye that I am?" And it was Peter that says, "Thou art the Christ." So that's the place, the location of where Caesarea Philippi is. So hopefully some of those notes will make sense as we go through further, looking at the character of the Apostle Paul, as we look primarily at the book of Acts. But number 5, we'll get to Roman rule starting next week. Okay, if you missed anything, see me afterwards. But let's have a word of prayer, and then we'll be dismissed tonight. Brother Rick, could you dismiss us in prayer, please?